Listen, we need to talk about what Marvel is doing, because this whole situation with Avengers Doomsday has gotten completely out of hand, and honestly, nobody seems to be addressing the elephant in the room, which is that this movie might actually be too smart for its own good, depending on how you look at it. But either way, there are so many theories flying around right now that it feels like the entire fan base has collectively lost their minds. And you know what? Maybe that's the point. Maybe Marvel wants us to go crazy trying to figure out what's happening. Because when you really dig into all these theories and all these clues and all these little details, they've been dropping for literal years. It starts to become clear that either Marvel has been playing four-dimensional chess this whole time, or they're just throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. And honestly, I cannot tell which one it is anymore. But let's start with the most bonkers theory of them all, which is that Tony Stark was adopted. And before you roll your eyes and click away, just hear me out, because this theory actually has legs, and it's kind of terrifying when you think about it. So here's the thing. In Avengers Endgame, when Tony and Steve go back in time to the 70s, Tony specifically puts July 4th, 1970 into the time travel GPS thingy, right? We all saw this happen. It's right there on screen, clear as day. But here's where it gets weird, because Tony Stark's actual birthday, according to every piece of MCU canon we have, is May 29th, 1970, which means that when they arrive in July, Tony should already be like a month old. He should already be born. He should already exist as a baby somewhere in that timeline. So why is Howard Stark walking around talking about how excited he is about his pregnant wife? Why is he discussing a baby that hasn't been born yet, when that baby should already be there? And the really interesting part is that Tony looks confused during this scene. Like actually visibly confused. You can see it on his face, even though he covers it up with his usual sarcasm and deflection, because that's what Tony does. He makes jokes when things get uncomfortable. But his expression tells a different story. His expression says, something doesn't add up here. Something is wrong. Something about this interaction doesn't match what I know to be true about my own life. And that moment could just be a continuity error. Sure, Marvel makes mistakes sometimes. But what if it's not? What if that moment was intentional? What if Marvel put that discrepancy there on purpose, knowing that obsessive fans would catch it and start asking questions? Now here's where the comics come into play, because in the main Marvel Comics universe, the Earth 616 continuity, Tony Stark is actually adopted, like that's canon in the comics. Howard Stark had a biological son who died young, and then Howard and Maria adopted Tony and raised him as their own. And Tony didn't find out about this until much later, and it messed him up pretty badly, because it recontextualizes his entire relationship with his father. All that distance and disappointment and emotional coldness suddenly makes a different kind of sense. If Howard was grieving another child the whole time, if Howard was comparing Tony to a son he lost, if Tony was always trying to live up to an impossible standard set by a ghost he didn't even know existed, and the MCU has never confirmed this adoption storyline. They've never said Tony is adopted, but they've also never explicitly said he isn't. They've left that door open, and that's suspicious. That's the kind of thing you do when you want to keep your options available for later. So the theory goes like this, and stay with me because this gets wild. What if the baby that Howard was expecting in July 1970 wasn't Tony at all? What if the child who was supposed to be born into the Stark family was actually Victor Von Doom? What if, through some multiversal weirdness or timeline shenanigans or cosmic intervention, the child destined to be Howard and Maria's biological son was Doom, and then circumstances changed, reality shifted, something happened that altered that destiny, and instead, Tony got adopted into that family, which would mean that Tony Stark and Victor Von Doom are parallel outcomes from the same origin point. One version raised by the Starks with all their wealth and resources and expectations becomes Iron Man, the hero. The other version, born elsewhere or raised under different circumstances, becomes Doctor Doom, the villain. And this would explain so much about why Robert Downey Jr. is coming back to play Doom instead of Tony. It would explain why a multiversal version of Doom could show up and look at Tony and ask the most horrifying question possible, which is, why do you have my face? Why are you wearing the life that should have been mine? Why are you Iron Man in this universe when I should have been the one raised as a Stark? Think about how that reframes everything. Think about how that changes Tony and Howard's entire relationship. Because if Tony was adopted, and if some part of him knew it or sensed it, even subconsciously, then that emotional distance between him and Howard suddenly makes so much more sense. It wasn't just about Howard being a workaholic or being emotionally unavailable. It was about Howard grieving a biological son and being unable to fully connect with the adopted replacement. And it was about Tony constantly trying to prove himself worthy of a name and legacy that wasn't originally meant for him, fighting his whole life to justify his existence in a family that he was inserted into rather than born into. And even that confusion on Tony's face in Endgame becomes retroactively meaningful. It becomes the moment where Tony almost discovered the truth about himself, where he almost learned that the life he thought was his was actually someone else's destiny that got reassigned. And he brushed past it because looking too closely would have broken something fundamental in his understanding of who he is. Nothing here is confirmed, obviously. Marvel hasn't come out and said yes, Tony was adopted, and yes, Doom was supposed to be the Stark heir. But Marvel loves doing this. They love hiding massive reveals inside throwaway lines and uncomfortable pauses and tiny details that seem meaningless, until suddenly they're the most important thing in the entire franchise. And if Avengers Doomsday really is about confronting questions of who should have existed and who deserves the life they have, then Tony Stark being adopted isn't just a twist for shock value, it becomes the entire foundation for Doom's rage. It explains why Doom is so personally offended by the existence of this universe's heroes, why he sees them as thieves who stole destinies that belong to other people, why he thinks he has the right to remake reality into something more just. And honestly, that's terrifying because it means Doom might actually have a point. It means the villain might be right about some things, even if his methods are completely insane. But wait, it gets even crazier, because there's another theory that's equally convincing, and it has nothing to do with Doom at all. It's about Thor, and specifically about Thor's endgame. The idea that Avengers Doomsday is going to transform Thor into Rune King Thor, and that Avengers Secret Wars is where his story finally ends. And honestly, this theory makes so much sense that I'm kind of convinced it has to happen. Because the groundwork has been there since Thor Ragnarok, just hiding in plain sight, waiting for people to connect the dots. Remember when Odin tells Thor that even when he had two eyes he only saw half the picture? That line seemed important at the time, but it felt kind of abstract. Kind of metaphorical. But in Norse mythology, Odin sacrifices his eye to gain wisdom. He gives up physical sight to gain cosmic understanding. And in the comics, Rune King Thor follows basically the same path. He sacrifices everything he has, everything he is, to understand the runes that govern reality itself, to comprehend the fundamental code underlying existence. And Odin's death in Ragnarok wasn't just an emotional moment. It was a narrative handoff. It was the old king passing the torch to his son and saying, "Your journey is just beginning, and you need to walk the same path I walked to become what you're meant to be." From that point on, Thor's entire journey through the MCU has been about stripping away false sources of power, about losing everything he thought defined him so he could discover what actually makes him who he is. In Ragnarok, he learns that the hammer doesn't make him Thor, that his power comes from within, that godhood is inherent, not granted by objects. Then in Infinity War and Endgame, he gets a new weapon and new power, but he fails catastrophically. He arrives too late and strikes the wrong spot, and Thanos snaps anyway, and half the universe dies, and Thor collapses under the weight of that failure. He spirals into depression and addiction and self-hatred, because he cannot reconcile being a god with being someone who failed so completely. The Thor we see in Endgame has lost everything. His family, his people, his home, his confidence, his sense of purpose. He's a god who doesn't believe in himself anymore. A hero who can't look at his reflection without seeing a failure. The smart way to start Doomsday would be to establish the threat through mounting tension, not immediate destruction. Show us that universes are starting to destabilize. Show us that the multiverse is sick and getting sicker. Show us heroes trying to hold things together and slowly realizing that they can't. Build dread and inevitability. Make us afraid of what's coming, rather than immediately showing us the worst case scenario. Because once you've shown the worst case scenario in your opening scene, you have nowhere to escalate to. You've already played your biggest card, and the rest of the movie has to either match that level constantly, which is exhausting, or fall below it, which feels anticlimactic. Neither option is good. But let's get back to the theories, because there's another one that's absolutely wild, and it involves Reed Richards, and the possibility that Doctor Doom isn't a villain who lost, but rather a villain who was written out of existence entirely. There's this fan edit going around that shows Pedro Pascal's Reed Richards facing Doom, who says, "I was there until you decided I wasn't. You didn't defeat me, you revised reality." And that one line reframes everything because it suggests that Doom was originally present during the Fantastic Four movie, that he was part of that story, that he mattered and existed and had agency, and then Reed Richards made the decision to erase him from the timeline completely. Not kill him, not imprison him, but remove him from existence itself, as though he had never been born. Think about how absolutely horrifying that is. From Doom's perspective, imagine existing and mattering and having relationships and goals, and then suddenly you don't exist anymore. You've been deleted, unmade, revised out of reality by someone who decided that the universe would be better off without you in it. And somehow you remember, somehow you retain knowledge of what was done to you. You know that you existed, and then you know that someone deliberately took that existence away. That's not defeat, that's existential violation. How many beings are walking around with the vague sense that something is wrong with reality but unable to articulate what? This opens up so many narrative possibilities that it's almost overwhelming. And that ties into another theory about the Doomsday trailers themselves, because apparently the Russo brothers said that those short teasers aren't actually trailers at all. They're clues, they're stories, and fans have started analyzing the numbers that appear at the end of each teaser and discovered that they work as timestamps, pointing to specific moments in Avengers Endgame. Like the Steve Rogers teaser has the numbers 12420, which is 1 hour 24 minutes and 20 seconds into Endgame. And if you jump to exactly that moment, you get the Ancient One explaining branch timelines to Bruce Banner. You get the scene that establishes the rules for how time travel works in the MCU. Thanks for hearing all the rubbish I got to say. Later.
Stephen Strange is currently performing surgery about 20 blocks that way. You're welcome to talk to him.